Here is Noodler's Heart of Darkness, a black ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Moramon Nemesis notebook.
This is a lose your thoughts into the dark abyss of this black ink. How has it taken so long for me to get to review this? This will be boring and beautiful as an ink. There's no tone variation by nib, and I've never seen any shading from it. A perfect black ink all the time. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it almost always performs exactly the same as it does on premium fountain pen friendly papers. I have been missing out by not having used this ink sooner. I see a bottle of it in my future, and yes, I am enjoying it a lot. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry. A Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet. A Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow. A Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is a Pilot E95S.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairefontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is black. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it doesn't shade, it's just fully black. Now, just taking a quick look at it, it might look like there's shading areas, but this is a soft nib. And so really what's happening is those are just thicker lines, putting a little bit more ink down, but it's not any kind of shading. Beautiful. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is the same tone as the soft fine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it doesn't shade. It is just crisp, clean, dark, solid black lines the whole time. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade. It does make me very happy to use the whole time. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, wet fine and soft fine with no feathering, no spread, no shading. Beautiful, standout black on the page. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairefontaine. Black. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it doesn't shade. It just performs amazingly. So if you really want that economy super dark black ink, this is it. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is the same tone as the soft fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade. It's amazing to look at the whole way. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade. It looks great, just as black on the page. I said it was going to be a boring review. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as it was with the medium, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade. It does look good. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairefontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with no shading, with solid black lines the whole way. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is the same tone as the soft fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. There is no feathering and there is no spread, there is no shading. We're going to be saying a lot of the same over and over again. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade. It does look like a beautiful dark black ink. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread, it does not shade. It's still just doing a great job. Looking at the back of the page, though, you can see this ink did get quite deep into the paper a lot, but it never bled through touching the page underneath. You might want to consider, with the medium or the broad, if you wanted to use the back of the page, I think you could get away with it, especially with the soft fine and that wet fine.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it's the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread, it does not shade. It does stand out on the quad rule without a problem because it is such a nice dark black. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is the same tone as the soft fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread, it does not shade. It does stand out from the quad rule. No problems. Man, this is a good ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread, it does not shade. It does look absolutely amazing. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread, it does not shade. It does a great job all the way through. I'm really still struck that I had not used this ink yet. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Cross Black. Here is Lamy Black. Here is Papier Plume Black. Here is Sailor Gentle Black. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairefontaine. Often this paper makes an ink look a little lighter and duller. It does not here. No bleeding, no feather, no spread, no shading, no change in performance at all. Just speechless. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is the same tone as the soft fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread, it does not shade. Looking at the medium nib, it's the same tone as it was with the wet fine, shocker. Same tone as the Clairefontaine, shocker. No feathering, shocker. No spread, shocker. No shading, Surprising, not a shocker. Surprising. That way we can be different on this one. Really, this is possibly one of the best student inks that I've come across, with it being so inexpensive and performing so well. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, and it does not spread. It does not shade. It does do an amazing job on this paper all the way through. All the papers really to this point. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. We can easily continue our notes back here.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Diatramentis Fuchsia. Here is Geherbon Bouquet d'Antan. Here is Diatramentis Mahatma Gandhi Saffron. Here is Lamy Ruby.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairefontaine. There is no feathering. There's a tiny bit of spread, barely noticeable, but tiny bit of spread. There's no shading. There's great performance, really. When you see it on the second line, that's a me mistake. If it didn't go down, I started to write is and then changed it to it. That was not the ink, it was me. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is the same tone as the soft fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does have tiny bits of feathering. You can see it on the word others on the second line. A little bit on the L's of rolled on the third line, but not much everywhere else. The spread is really minor, not too bad. No shading, great ink to use on this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does not shade. I'm going to take back the feathering because I see it on the S of shall in the third line. I'm sorry, I thought I had a great combination right here. The bit of feathers, no big deal at all. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. I see no feathering. I'm taking a last, I see a little bit, tiny bit of feathering on the upholden in the up part, but nowhere else. It's got a tiny bit of spread, but this is also a broad nib. You'd need to be writing, you know, a little larger than I tend to do here, and that's just a matter of fitting all of my writing on the paper. No shading, great performance. This paper needs this ink. Looking at the page underneath, I am pointing to the one dot that I don't think really is coming through on camera. It is tiny. It's circled. It bled and touched the page underneath with the medium nib, but it didn't do it with any of the others. Now, looking at the back of the page, you see you probably can't continue your notes back here because the ink does get fairly deep into the page. The soft fine, that is a drier writer, had a lot less of the ghosting. When it did start to shade, not shade, when it did start to have areas where the pen was down a little bit, it gets deeper into the page. So if you don't pause during your writing, getting more of the ink to come out, you won't have this problem, and you might be able to write on the back of the page with a dry, fine pen.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper. In every pen, it gave the same performance in its deep dark black with no shading lines at all. So the result of my decision is obvious. A dealer's choice. No matter what you use, you're going to get a predictable, boring, great performance out of this black ink, always knowing exactly what's going to happen.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.